My own son tossed me aside after getting 45 million. Then life forced him to beg at my door. Nicole Adams stood quietly at the edge of the grand ballroom, the soft hum of classical music swirling around her like an invisible barrier she didn't quite belong to. The glittering chandeliers illuminated the room with a warm golden glow, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the elegant gowns and sharp tuxedos of the city's elite. It was the kind of event she'd never imagined attending. Not as a guest, certainly. Not dressed in her modest but clean dress, holding a small clutch almost too plain for the extravagant venue. Yet here she was, summoned reluctantly by her son, Ethan. Ethan, now 25, with a newly inherited $45 million fortune, had transformed overnight. Where once he had been a humble, thoughtful boy, he now carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and worse, a sharp edge of coldness toward his own mother. Tonight was supposed to be his grand entrance into the high society his grandfather had built, a night celebrating his new status and future plans. But as Nicole scanned the sea of unfamiliar faces, all polished smiles and whispered judgments, she felt the tension coil tighter in her chest. Her eyes found Ethan easily. He was standing tall near the center, surrounded by impeccably dressed friends, laughing loudly as if to drown out any trace of his small-town upbringing. His expensive suit clung just so, and the gleam in his eyes was different now, aloof and distant. When he noticed her presence, his smile faltered for just a moment before he turned away, dismissing her as if she were invisible. Then came the moment Nicole had feared. Ethan's voice rang clear over the murmurs, calling the crowd to attention. "Before we begin, I need to address something personal," he said, directing his gaze straight at her. Murmurs rippled through the room, shifting from polite conversation to shock. "My mother," he began, his tone sharp and dismissive, "has been a burden on my life, holding me back from truly reaching the heights I deserve." Gasps filled the air as heads turned toward Nicole, whose face flushed crimson. She swallowed hard, words failing her as Ethan's public rejection spread like wildfire. "I'm done with the distractions," he continued coldly. "Tonight I make a clean break. This is where I leave the past behind." Without waiting for response, Ethan gestured sharply toward the exit. Nicole, stunned and humiliated in a room full of strangers, who had just witnessed her son obliterate the years of sacrifice and love she had poured into him, felt tears burn behind her eyelids. Holding her head high despite the sting, she stepped out silently, the heavy doors closing behind her like a verdict. And outside, the night felt colder than she'd ever known. The cold air outside the grand hall hit Nicole like a wave, sharp and unforgiving. She stood alone on the marble steps, her breath visible in the night as it trembled with quiet sobs she refused to release. The echoes of the stunned crowd behind her still lingered in her ears. The whispers, the gasps, the unmistakable sound of judgment. It was more than just humiliation. It was a profound, aching betrayal from the person she had sacrificed everything for. Ethan's words gnawed at her, relentless and cruel, each one a dagger twisting deeper into the heart she had guarded for so long. Behind those polished walls, the guests whispered rumors and speculations. Nicole could hear fragments even from a distance. How could he say that to his own mother? That poor woman, she always looked so tired but proud. A mother's love isn't supposed to be met with such ingratitude. But the murmurs felt hollow, distant. What stung most was the internal fracture. Ethan's cold rejection wasn't just public. It was deeply personal, an erasure of all her years of love, labor, and faith. For days afterward, Nicole found herself trapped in a whirlwind of pain and doubt. Friends and neighbors offered kind words, but her mind kept replaying the event, the sharp edge of Ethan's voice, the finality of his words. She questioned herself, wondering if she had failed somehow. Was the humility and frugality she'd instilled in him a mistake? Had her sacrifices been a weight rather than a stepping stone? The torment was suffocating, but beneath the despair, a flicker of defiance began to burn. She knew that giving up wasn't an option. Ethan's rejection, as cruel as it was, would not define her worth or her future. Meanwhile, Ethan bloomed in the spotlight. His arrogance fueled by newfound wealth and a glittering social circle that seemed eager to embrace his bravado. The more Nicole's absence was noted, the louder Ethan erased her from his narrative. His friends admired his success, but whispered cautiously about his icy demeanor and the scandal of his public disowning. Yet no one dared question him face to face. The world was impressed with the billionaire heir, the confident young man, not the mother he had just discarded. And yet, as some in Ethan's circle began to sense the hollowness beneath the grandeur, others found a strange sympathy for Nicole. They saw through the veneer of wealth to the woman who had truly built foundations beneath Ethan's golden tower. Quiet messages of encouragement slipped through social media from anonymous allies, and a community slowly rallied around her story, inspired by the dignity with which she bore the injustice. If you've ever faced rejection that felt like the end of the world, you know how hard it is to hold on to hope. But Nicole's journey reminds us that sometimes the darkest moments reveal the strongest light within us, a light that can lead to an unexpected and powerful transformation. Her story isn't just about heartbreak. It's about the courage to rise beyond it. Nicole's days began to blend into each other, a rhythm of quiet resilience amid the echoes of that painful night. She woke early each morning, the weight of Ethan's rejection heavy in her chest. But rather than collapsing under it, she sought small ways to rebuild what had been broken. At first, she tried reaching out to Ethan, sending polite messages, offering help, hoping to soften the hardened walls between them, but each attempt went unanswered or met with curt replies that only deepened her sorrow. The silence from her son was a constant reminder of how far apart they had drifted. In the meantime, Nicole turned her focus inward. She revisited dreams she had long shelved, dreams that had nothing to do with wealth or social standing, but everything to do with passion and purpose. She started researching sustainable business practices and community projects, envisioning a space where people from all walks of life could come together, not to flaunt riches, but to share warmth and human connection. The idea of opening a cafe in the heart of the neighborhood she knew so well seemed both comforting and daunting. It was a far cry from the opulence Ethan now surrounded himself with, but for Nicole, it felt authentic. Yet the road was not smooth. Financial constraints loomed large. Landlords were skeptical, and the shadow of her public humiliation made some cautious investors wary. Nicole faced whispered doubts and sideways glances from those who didn't understand why a woman with a hurt heart would dare start over in such a way. There were days when the exhaustion threatened to consume her, when the loneliness pressed in so tightly she questioned if it was all worth the fight. But then, small victories appeared, a friendly neighbor volunteering to paint the walls, a local vendor offering discounted supplies, a stranger stopping by to express admiration for Nicole's courage. Even so, the sting of Ethan's absence never fully faded. Every successful small step forward was tinged with a dull ache from the empty seat beside her. She missed the son she once knew, the boy who dreamed not of money, but of music and kindness. Those memories were her anchors, fragile but steady, amidst the storm. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of the world Ethan had entered, the parties, the headlines, the fleeting nature of his alliances. Rumors circulated about unstable business deals and strained friendships. Though Nicole had no desire to gloat, a quiet part of her felt the harsh tug of irony. The wealth that had created distance between them was beginning to crumble around him. She wished, above all else, that he would come to understand the true meaning of family before it was too late. For anyone who has endured the sharp pain of being cast aside by those they love, Nicole's story is a testament to the power of endurance. Even when the future feels uncertain and the path seems lonely, there lies a strength in choosing hope over despair and in trusting that new beginnings often arise from the ashes of heartbreak. Months passed, and the mounting pressures on Nicole seemed relentless. The modest cafe she was desperately trying to build became a battleground of obstacles. One chilly autumn evening, As Nicole prepared to welcome her first small group of customers, a message arrived that cut deeper than any wound before. It was from Ethan. Brief, cold, and dismissive, he told her he wanted nothing to do with her. No explanations, no apologies, just a final severance that shattered whatever hope Nicole had left for reconciliation. That night, sitting alone in the unfinished cafe, surrounded by empty tables and the faint scent of fresh paint, Nicole felt the crushing weight of abandonment. Her heart ached deeply, not just from her son's rejection, but from the unbearable loneliness that now cloaked her world. The humiliation she had faced in the grand ballroom felt like a cruel prelude to this heavier, more private despair. Adding to her trials, a group of influential investors who had initially shown interest suddenly withdrew their support after hearing harsh gossip about her family drama. Their polite smiles masked judgment and whispered doubts. Why back a woman torn apart by scandal? They seemed to think. With funds disappearing fast, Nicole faced the terrifying possibility that her dream might be crushed before it even began. It wasn't just the financial strain. It was also the invisible burden of community skepticism. Even neighbors who once offered kind words began to distance themselves, unsure how to associate with someone caught in such a painful public fall from grace. Nicole's resilience was tested like never before. Her body felt exhausted, yet her spirit flickered desperately to hold on. One evening, a passerby recognized Nicole, nodding with silent sympathy. But the harshest blow came from within. Nicole's own self-doubt began to gnaw away, whispering that perhaps Ethan's cold words were true. Maybe her presence was truly a weight on his life. These dark thoughts wrapped tightly around her, despite every rational thought telling her otherwise. Still, amid the crushing weight, Nicole felt a small seed of fierce determination sprouting somewhere deep inside. She was at her lowest, yes, but it was clear to her that this was not the end. Her past sacrifices, the love she had given, and the faith she still held may have been rejected, but they were not erased. They were the foundation on which she would rise again. At the edge of despair, Nicole found herself staring out the window of the empty cafe, eyes brimming with tears she refused to shed. The city lights flickered with promises of change somewhere out there, beyond her grief and humiliation. And in that fragile moment, she made a silent vow. She would not be defined by the rejection of her own son or by the judgment of strangers. There was a new story waiting to be written, one of courage forged through pain and strength built from love. For anyone who has ever felt pushed beyond their breaking point by the coldness of those they hold dear, Nicole's path is a poignant reminder. Even in the bleakest nights, when isolation and failure seem overwhelming, there exists a choice: succumb to defeat or rise, steadfast and unapologetic. It is often at our lowest points that the greatest transformations begin. And for Nicole, that transformation was just beginning. If you have ever felt alone in your struggle, remember this is where true strength is born. The weight of the world seemed to suffocate Madison as the echoes of laughter and scorn clung to her like an unbearable cloak. She had never imagined humiliation could reach such depths. The relentless whispers slicing through the sanctuary of her own mind, leaving nothing but raw, exposed nerves. The cafe, once a place where she found quiet solace to sip her coffee and think, had transformed into a stage for her disgrace. The betrayal etched on the faces around her, and the sting of their judgment sinking deep into her heart. Yet in the midst of this darkness, where hope seemed a fragile, flickering flame, something within her stirred. Madison sat alone on the worn wooden bench outside the cafe, the cool evening air brushing against her tear-streaked face. Her hands trembled as they clutched a small, crumpled note, the only trace of kindness she had found that day. It had been handed to her silently, almost surreptitiously, by an elderly woman she barely noticed amid the sea of judgmental faces. The note read simply, "Strength lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall." The words echoed in her mind, a quiet defiance against the narrative that had been forced upon her. As she folded the note carefully, Madison realized that beneath the weight of humiliation, there was an undeniable truth. This was a moment, terrifying and painful as it was, that could either consume her or awaken something stronger. The elderly woman had smiled gently as she passed by, her eyes full of understanding and empathy, a stark contrast to the cold indifference of the others. This shared moment of human kindness sparked a fragile seed of hope inside Madison's weary soul. Determined to grasp at this glimmer, Madison thought about reaching out, about searching beyond the mocking whispers and the stinging words that had become her reality. But uncertainty clung to her like a shadow, making each step forward feel treacherous. She remembered a friend from college, Maya, who had once faced her own demons with courage and had since become a counselor, the kind of person who seemed to shine light through the darkest corners of the heart. The idea of contacting Maya was intimidating. Would she understand? Would she see Madison through the lens of compassion rather than failure? Doubt gnawed at her, yet the prospect of isolation was far worse. For the first time since the incident, Madison felt a faint but growing resolve stretching within her, a need to reclaim control, not by erasing what had happened, but by transforming it. This fragile resolve was tested again the next morning when, at work, she overheard her coworkers chuckling and exchanging cruel remarks. The stings familiar and raw. But something interesting occurred. This time, instead of retreating, Madison locked eyes with one colleague, someone she had never spoken to much before. To her surprise, she saw flickers of discomfort in their expression, a silent acknowledgement of injustice. It reminded her that beneath layers of hurt and cruelty, empathy could still exist. As the days unfolded, Madison began to notice more subtle gestures. A nod of encouragement from a stranger. A quiet word of support from a neighbor. These moments began to stitch together a tapestry of resilience around her battered spirit. Though the path ahead was far from clear, Madison's growing awareness that kindness and inner strength were never entirely out of reach gave her a tentative sense of courage. Before taking the next step toward healing, Madison resolved to confront her pain, to write down everything she felt without fear of judgment or suppression. The act of pouring her heart onto paper became a turning point, a private reckoning where vulnerability transformed into power. In each word, she reclaimed a piece of herself lost in the shame and doubt. As she prepared to share her story with the one person who might help her find clarity and direction, Madison did not yet know the magnitude of the change about to ripple through her life. But one thing was clear. The deepest wounds often serve as the catalyst for the most extraordinary transformations, and sometimes the quietest moments of connection spark the fiercest fires of hope. If you've ever felt overwhelmed in your darkest moments, remember that reaching out, even in small ways, can be the first step toward reclaiming your strength and dignity. When Madison finally dialed Maya's number, her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the whirlpool of emotions that had become a permanent storm inside her. The voice on the other end was warm, familiar, and infused with a kind of gentle strength that Madison hadn't realized she craved so desperately. Maya listened intently as Madison poured out her story, her voice trembling with the weight of humiliation and despair she had carried for weeks. But instead of offering empty comfort, Maya's words were a revelation, a mixture of honest reflection and practical hope that pierced through Madison's fog of self-doubt. Sometimes we let others define us through their cruelty, but that doesn't mean it's the truth, Maya said softly. What they see isn't the whole picture. You're so much more than their harsh whispers. It was a simple truth, yet it landed with the force of a tidal wave. For the first time, Madison felt unshackled from the identity her tormentors had tried to force upon her. Inspired by their conversation, Madison decided to take a bold step. She would address the ordeal publicly, not with bitterness or anger, but with honesty and courage. What started as a draft of a personal essay soon transformed into a powerful narrative about vulnerability, human error, and reclaiming dignity. She planned to share it on a community blog known for its support of those facing social judgment. When the post went live, it rippled through her world in unexpected ways. Messages of encouragement flooded her inbox, from strangers who had faced similar pain to friends who had been silent in the background. One comment in particular caught Madison's attention, a note from the very colleague who had once looked away during the cruel jokes. Their words spoke volumes about silent support and the courage to stand up. Meanwhile, the group responsible for her public humiliation found themselves the subject of unexpected scrutiny. Their casual cruelty was dissected in community forums, and as voices grew louder against such behavior, the social dynamics began to shift. Madison noticed the hesitant glances and the faltering confidence of those who had tried to break her. They were being challenged not just by her resilience, but by a collective unwillingness to accept cruelty. One day, while walking through the office, Madison caught the eye of the most vocal antagonist, a woman named Claire. Their encounter was electric with unspoken tension. Claire's usual smugness was replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, and for a moment, the facade cracked. Madison met her gaze steadily, not with vengeance, but with quiet strength that conveyed an indelible message. She was no longer a victim to be defined by others' malice. That evening, as Madison scrolled through messages of support, her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "I'm proud of you. You're turning pain into power. Keep shining." The words were a balm for her bruised spirit. This moment marked a pivot, the real start of Madison's journey, not just to heal, but to inspire others. She understood now that vulnerability was not weakness. Her willingness to expose her story openly forced her tormentors into a reckoning and gave voice to those who had suffered in silence. If you've ever faced a mountain that seemed impossible to climb, remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stand tall and share your truth. Your story might just be the spark that lights the way for others lost in the dark. The days that followed unfolded like a slow, steady triumph over the shadows that had once engulfed Madison's life. Her story, vulnerable, raw, and honest, had ignited a conversation that extended far beyond her immediate circle. The community she had reached out to embraced her courage, and with each new message of support, Madison's confidence grew stronger, transforming her from a figure of pity into one of admiration. At work, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Madison noticed subtle gestures of solidarity, a quiet nod from a usually indifferent coworker, a genuine smile from someone she had once thought neutral, even murmurs of apology from those who had formerly sided with the cruelty. The energy that once crackled with hostility was replaced, gradually, with an undercurrent of respect. The very people who had delighted in her humiliation found themselves vulnerable under the weight of collective disapproval. Office meetings felt different. Voices softened, and the obvious divide began to narrow. One afternoon, Madison found herself called into a meeting with her manager and HR representative. Tension prickled her skin as she entered the room, unsure of the direction this would take. But rather than admonishment or blame, what followed was a stark acknowledgement of the wrongs she had endured and a commitment to change. "We've been made aware of the situation and the impact it's had on you," the HR representative said earnestly. "This company does not condone harassment or bullying, and we want to make sure you're supported going forward." The promise of action and genuine concern filled Madison with a cautious optimism. For the first time, she felt seen, not just as an employee, but as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Emboldened by this, Madison felt a tide of empowerment surge through her veins. She began to assert herself more openly, voicing her ideas confidently in meetings and volunteering for new projects with an untarnished spirit. Her resilience became contagious. Colleagues started to share their own stories of overcoming hardship, creating a ripple effect of openness and trust within the team. The antagonist Claire, once fierce and unyielding, gradually faded into the background. Her arrogance diminished under the scrutiny of her peers and the undeniable glow of Madison's transformation. Where once Madison would have cracked under Claire's sharp words or biting glances, she now met them with quiet composure and an unshakable self-worth. One evening, after a long day of celebrating a successful project, Madison stood before a small group of coworkers who had gathered to mark the occasion. A colleague raised a glass in her honor, recognizing not just her hard work, but the courage it took to rise above adversity. The room filled with genuine applause, and Madison felt a wave of emotion swell in her chest. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, not from pain or humiliation, but from the profound relief and joy of finally reclaiming her narrative. The humiliation that had once threatened to define her had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a strength born of authenticity and perseverance. Madison's journey was far from over, but at that moment she stood triumphant, not because the past was erased, but because she had learned to carry it with grace and courage. The lesson she embodied was clear. True strength is forged in the fires of adversity, and justice, though slow, can prevail when one refuses to surrender. In times of hardship, remember that your struggles do not define you. Stand tall, speak your truth, and know that resilience can transform even the darkest moments into the brightest victories. When Madison finally dialed Maya's number, her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the whirlpool of emotions that had become a permanent storm inside her. The voice on the other end was warm, familiar, and infused with a kind of gentle strength that Madison hadn't realized she craved so desperately. Maya listened intently as Madison poured out her story, her voice trembling with the weight of humiliation and despair she had carried for weeks. But instead of offering empty comfort, Maya's words were a revelation, a mixture of honest reflection and practical hope that pierced through Madison's fog of self-doubt. Sometimes we let others define us through their cruelty, but that doesn't mean it's the truth, Maya said softly. What they see isn't a whole picture. You're so much more than their harsh whispers. It was a simple truth, yet it landed with the force of a tidal wave. For the first time, Madison felt unshackled from the identity her tormentors had tried to force upon her. Inspired by their conversation, Madison decided to take a bold step. She would address the ordeal publicly, not with bitterness or anger, but with honesty and courage. What started as a draft of a personal essay soon transformed into a powerful narrative about vulnerability, human error, and reclaiming dignity. She planned to share it on a community blog known for its support of those facing social judgment. When the post went live, it rippled through her world in unexpected ways. Messages of encouragement flooded her inbox, from strangers who had faced similar pain to friends who had been silent in the background. One comment in particular caught Madison's attention, a note from the very colleague who had once looked away during the cruel jokes. Their words spoke volumes about silent support and the courage to stand up. Meanwhile, the group responsible for her public humiliation found themselves the subject of unexpected scrutiny. Their casual cruelty was dissected in community forums, and as voices grew louder against such behavior, the social dynamics began to shift. Madison noticed the hesitant glances and the faltering confidence of those who had tried to break her. They were being challenged not just by her resilience, but by a collective unwillingness to accept cruelty. One day, while walking through the office, Madison caught the eye of the most vocal antagonist, a woman named Claire. Their encounter was electric, with unspoken tension. Claire's usual smugness was replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, and for a moment, the facade cracked. Madison met her gaze steadily, not with vengeance, but with quiet strength that conveyed an indelible message. She was no longer a victim to be defined by others' malice. That evening, as Madison scrolled through messages of support, her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "I'm proud of you. You're turning pain into power. Keep shining." The words were a balm for her bruised spirit. This moment marked a pivot, the real start of Madison's journey not just to heal, but to inspire others. She understood now that vulnerability was not weakness. Her willingness to expose her story openly forced her tormentors into a reckoning and gave voice to those who had suffered in silence. If you've ever faced a mountain that seemed impossible to climb, remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stand tall and share your truth. Your story might just be the spark that lights the way for others lost in the dark.